At around 3:40 a.m., Ukrainian forces launched a large-scale drone operation against the Feodosia oil terminal in occupied Crimea. The facility was one of the last working fuel depots on the peninsula, supplying both the Russian military and local civilians. According to reports, nearly 250 kamikaze-type UAVs were involved in the coordinated attack. Several explosions were recorded soon after, followed by massive fires across the complex. The flames spread rapidly, destroying pipelines, loading docks, and large sections of fuel storage infrastructure. This was the opening strike, and it was not a random act of aggression. The operation was part of a long-term plan to cut off Crimea's energy supply and weaken Russian logistics across southern Ukraine. Satellite and open-source intelligence had observed tanker deliveries to Feodosia for months. The setup was clear. Feodosia served as a primary hub for the Black Sea Fleet and Russian ground forces stationed across the region. Analysts repeatedly warned that if Feodosia were hit, it would cripple the peninsula's fuel supply. Earlier Ukrainian strikes on refineries in Bryansk, Krasnodar, and Oryol had already reduced the flow of refined products into Crimea. By early October, Feodosia had become the single largest fuel reserve left under Russian control. In the weeks before the operation, Ukraine had intensified pressure on key supply routes, a period later referred to by experts as the siege. Repeated attacks on the Kerch Bridge limited its ability to carry heavy fuel convoys. Naval drone strikes increased shipping insurance costs, forcing Russian tankers to cancel voyages. Sabotage operations targeted railway lines, while cyber attacks delayed transport systems. Each action was designed to isolate Crimea from mainland Russia's logistics network. Finally, on October 6th, Ukraine launched what analysts now call the final blow. Drone waves approached from multiple directions to overload radar coverage. Russian Panzer S-1 and S-300 systems fired interceptors but failed to stop every target. Footage posted online showed drones striking fuel tanks directly, followed by a series of large secondary explosions. The impact destroyed most of the site's operational capacity in minutes. Satellite images taken after the strike showed extensive burn scars and complete loss of several fuel tanks and pipelines. The Feodosia oil terminal was effectively destroyed. Within hours, it became clear that the attack was not only a tactical victory, but also a strategic one. It marked the end of Feodosia's role as Crimea's last major fuel reserve. The immediate loss of this facility began a chain reaction that would soon cripple both military operations and civilian life across the peninsula. The destruction of the Feodosia terminal caused immediate and severe direct impacts across Crimea. More than half of the peninsula's refined fuel capacity was lost in a single night. The fires consumed vast quantities of diesel and aviation fuel that were intended for tanks, aircraft, and power generators. By morning, the entire supply network began to fail. Fuel stations in multiple districts reported they were out of stock. In major towns, long queues of cars formed outside the few stations still operating. Local reports said that more than half of all fuel outlets in Crimea closed within 24 hours. Diesel for agricultural and industrial use was no longer available. The shortage affected both military and civilian sectors. Armored vehicles faced delays, airfields ran short on aviation fuel, and backup generators at hospitals and government buildings began to shut down. Power supply disruptions started to appear across several areas as stored reserves ran out. This forced local authorities to take emergency measures. The Russian defenses reacted quickly, but with limited success. Regional administrations imposed emergency fuel rationing. Civilians were restricted to 20 liters per vehicle, and commercial trucks were limited to 50 liters per day. Security checkpoints were placed near fuel stations to control distribution. The local government referred to the situation as temporary and under control, but reports from residents showed otherwise. Independent monitors confirmed major structural damage at the Feodosia terminal, contradicting official statements. Russian state media described the incident as a fire, avoiding mention of a Ukrainian strike. Communications around Feodosia were reportedly jammed during the attack, disrupting coordination between air defense units, emergency responders, and firefighting services. These delays allowed the fires to spread further. In some cases, firefighters were unable to reach the site for several hours. Attempts to import small amounts of fuel from mainland Russia faced logistical problems due to restricted transport routes and security risks. Within days, the situation escalated into civilian collapse. Public transportation routes were suspended because buses and service vehicles had no fuel. Hospitals, bakeries, and food storage facilities that relied on generators began experiencing power cuts. Markets and refrigeration systems struggled to operate. Farmers were unable to harvest or transport crops because tractors and trucks were out of diesel. The local economy slowed to a near standstill. People began walking long distances as private and public transport became unavailable. Black market fuel prices rose sharply, in some areas increasing tenfold compared to the previous week. Residents started storing small amounts of fuel in bottles and containers, increasing fire hazards. Long lines formed at any operational station, with some people waiting overnight for limited supplies. The lack of fuel also caused supply disruptions for food, water, and essential goods. Daily life in Crimea became heavily dependent on small generators and emergency deliveries, neither of which could meet the growing demand. The once functioning peninsula now faced a full-scale humanitarian and logistical crisis triggered by one decisive strike. The growing shortage soon exposed the full scale of the blockade. With the Feodosia terminal destroyed, Crimea no longer had the capacity to store or refine large quantities of fuel. The Kerch Bridge, which had already been damaged by previous Ukrainian strikes, was unable to handle heavy tanker traffic or large-scale shipments by road or rail. Sea transport faced its own problems. The presence of Ukrainian naval drones in the Black Sea forced insurance companies to suspend coverage for fuel shipments to Crimean ports, effectively halting all major sea deliveries. Railway connections were unreliable due to sabotage operations and repeated cyber attacks on signal systems. Freight trains carrying fuel were delayed, rerouted, or canceled altogether. Ferry operations between Crimea and mainland Russia were also suspended several times because of security alerts and mechanical breakdowns. These conditions created a situation where every major transport route into Crimea was either damaged, closed, or too dangerous to use. As a result, the peninsula became completely cut off from large-scale refueling operations. Fuel reserves that remained inside Crimea were quickly consumed by emergency services, generators, and limited military use. Power generation plants started operating at reduced capacity, leading to rolling blackouts across several districts. Vehicles, both military and civilian, stood idle due to lack of diesel and gasoline. Roads that once carried supply convoys turned empty. The energy crisis expanded into a full logistical shutdown. Crimea had become isolated not by occupation, but by exhaustion. Behind this campaign was a broader military strategy known as the Deep Strike Doctrine. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirmed that these attacks were part of a long-range precision plan designed to cripple Russia's logistics network rather than focus solely on frontline battles. Over a period of 2 months, Ukrainian forces targeted at least 85 high-value sites across Russia and occupied territories. These included military fuel depots, power stations, and industrial plants critical to wartime production. Each successful strike weakened Russia's ability to sustain its operations in southern Ukraine. Analysts estimated that the destruction of fuel infrastructure in Crimea reduced the Russian military's operational mobility to minimal levels. Tanks, armored vehicles, and transport trucks became dependent on smaller, less reliable sources. Fighter jets based on the peninsula faced refueling delays, forcing them to reduce flight operations. The scale of the damage showed that Ukraine's approach was focused on endurance rather than immediate territorial gains. By attacking supply lines, transport nodes, and refineries deep inside enemy-held territory, Ukraine managed to restrict the movement of nearly 60,000 Russian troops stationed in Crimea. The doctrine emphasized that without fuel, even advanced hardware becomes useless. The success of this campaign demonstrated a shift in modern warfare, where cutting logistics can be as decisive as winning direct battles. Crimea became the clearest example of how deep strikes could achieve strategic goals without full-scale assaults. The effects of the Crimean fuel crisis quickly spread into the Russian mainland, leading to what analysts described as an economic freefall. Independent economic reports estimated that nearly 38% of Russia's national oil refining capacity, or about 330,000 tons of crude per day, was taken offline by September. Several large refineries in the Leningrad and Ryazan regions suspended operations after suffering previous drone and missile strikes. This created a widespread shortage that went beyond Crimea. Domestic fuel prices rose sharply, and distribution delays began affecting agriculture, manufacturing, and transport sectors inside Russia. In response, Moscow introduced a temporary ban on gasoline exports to stabilize internal supply. The government also turned to Belarus and some Asian suppliers for emergency imports, but those shipments were too limited to offset the losses. Financial analysts reported a minor but steady decline in Russia's GDP, contracting by around 0.6% over 2 consecutive quarters. Consumer confidence weakened, and business activity slowed across several regions. These developments indicated that the economic effects of the Ukrainian campaign were not local, but national. The collapse of Crimea's fuel infrastructure had created ripples that extended throughout Russia's wider energy and industrial system. At the same time, political repercussions began to appear. The Kremlin's long-standing claim that Crimea was a secure and self-sufficient region came under heavy criticism. Local residents, who had been promised stability, faced rationing, power shortages, and transport shutdowns. The Russian government tried to control the narrative by describing the situation as temporary and manageable, but frustration among the public continued to grow. Increased taxes and rising prices made daily life more difficult. In an effort to cover expanding military expenses, the government raised the value-added tax, which shifted the economic burden directly onto civilians. This move was widely criticized by analysts and compared to earlier situations in neighboring countries where fuel price increases had triggered public protests. State-controlled media avoided discussing the scale of the crisis, while independent observers highlighted the growing economic and social strain. The damage to infrastructure, combined with the visible decline in living conditions, undermined Moscow's portrayal of Crimea as a permanent and stable part of the Russian Federation. Finally, the operation sent the message that Ukraine intended to communicate. The Feodosia strike was not an isolated incident, but the final result of months of coordinated attacks targeting the foundation of Russia's war logistics. By cutting off energy routes and storage facilities, Ukraine showed that it could weaken a stronger opponent without engaging in direct large-scale combat. The message extended beyond the battlefield. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, control over logistics and supply networks determines endurance more than territory or numbers. Crimea, once described by Russian officials as an unshakable bastion, was now struggling with shortages, blackouts, and declining public morale. The strike at Feodosia proved that infrastructure can be as vulnerable as front lines, and that sustained pressure on fuel and transport systems can achieve results equal to major offensives. The campaign left Crimea isolated, its military capacity reduced, and its economy dependent on emergency measures. What began as a single night attack had evolved into a long-term shift in the balance of power across the region.